Welcome to the working part of my studio. I'm going to do a little bit of work while we talk because honestly, if my hands aren't doing something, I don't feel quite natural. So, working on a piece that's similar to the one in the Workhouse International this year, I use a very gritty stoneware, mid-range. It's got a very low shrinkage and very low plasticity, and that allows me to build very high, relatively efficiently and fast. It means I spend a little more time on finishing because of the coarseness of the surface, but it allows me to be able to see the entire form, view it, alter it as needed without having to worry too much about shrinkage preventing that. I can always go back and work on a lower section, add things wherever I need to, because with the very low shrinkage, the discrepancy during drying is much, much lower. That gives me a lot more freedom to work with larger pieces in a holistic way. As you can see, I'm working in a method that approximates coiling, but I got over actually rolling coils, quite a long time ago. When I work my clay, I just pull it out and squish it into an approximate linear shape because that's an efficient way to add it to the form. But I don't see the point in spending time on rolling it, since by the time I'm done, I will have pinched it and altered it to whatever shape I want, and the initial configuration doesn't matter that much. Some people really seem to get lost in the perfection of the coil rather than the perfection of the work, and that's a short-term effort for very little long-term gain. I regard pinching really as the most essential aspect of this. Coiling is just a method of adding clay to the form. Pinching is what makes the form. This is a relatively low plasticity clay, as I said, so I need to work getting the essentials of the form roughed out pretty early on before I go back and worry about the details. So I'm building as I go, taking time to step back and look at the overall form incrementally, but pinching it. Pinching is nothing but the compression and expansion of the plasticity of the clay. Got a relatively narrow window to do that with this clay body, but it's essentially the critical factor for all clay is that working of the plasticity. Unless you're casting or mold forming, it's all about the plasticity. It's about the resistance to gravity and the relationship to moisture. Even working on the wheel, I regard as just a form of pinching with some mechanical assistance. The wheel is sometimes regarded as a terribly magical thing, but it's just a tool that moves the clay past your hands at a steady rate. The action that you perform on the clay, that contraction, compression, and expansion, that's the same as it is if you're working without the wheel entirely. It's just a convenient mechanical assist. As you can see, I'm building just by adding the clay. I generally add it to the inside. Then once I've got that double thick layer, I pinch to restore the thickness, which means moving that extra clay upward as I go. A lot of people have learned to work with coils by stacking them on one another, like Lincoln logs. Why? If you set the clay on top, then you've got to join it thoroughly and deeply from both sides to get an effective joint. And that works pretty well because coil building that way leaves so many joints that no one of them is really a focus for stresses during drying and firing. But it seems unnecessary. If you add the clay to the inside or the outside, side by side to the existing work, then you just pinch it to the correct thickness, and instead of having layers of joints, you get something that's effectively laminated from the inside out. It's a much stronger structure, and honestly, it seems like less work to me. You can see I can build fairly quickly this way, and sometimes for me the issue is I need to step back, see what I'm doing, look as I go, and then come back to it. Make sure I'm sticking to my plan. The details are mostly in my head through the entire process, and sometimes as this develops, those details will shift, but the underlying composition really does need to be determined in advance for larger work. Changing that on the fly can result in difficulties. This shape is going to have an arc to it, a fairly substantial one, as you can see. I'm starting in the middle of it rather than at the end because the bottom of it has quite a substantial undercut. And that's not really structurally sound if I try to build a lot of weight on top of it while the clay is still plastic. So I'll be building that part separately and then merging them together. And once this gets extremely tall, I may start working sideways. Sometimes working from the bottom up just isn't the sensible thing to do. So, by the magic of video, it's now about 15 minutes later. I'll be roughing out all of the parts of this form. Then I'll be working on the details. That'll take at least a week, just doing that. The roughing out of the form, honestly, that's the quickest part of the process. Refining it, adding the details, doing the surface finishes, all of that, that's honestly 3/4 of the effort, but it always feels good to get far along on the initial steps. This is the project you'll see in the Workhouse Exhibition. The botanical imagery is a new direction for this body of work, but the engineering imagery is something that has been at the core of my work for a very long time. I see engineering in metaphorical terms as something that reflects who we are as human beings in our desire to remake our circumstances, to alter the world for the better, to improve ourselves and our circumstances.